If you think of your earliest childhood memory, you probably remember playing with toys, the sound of laughter from the playground, or maybe even cuddling up to your mom when you didn't feel well. But Joanna Milan's earliest memories are filled with desolation and fear. Fear for her life.
Every day was the same. I was very ill. Usually you're pretty sleepy, you don't want to do anything. You had to keep very quiet. It was actually very frightening.
At the age of 3, suffering from malnutrition, scarlet fever, and hepatitis, Joanna didn't have anyone to take care of her. Neither did the 5 other orphans she was with. They took care of each other. With no adult supervision other than irregular food deliveries, they made it work. These 2 horrifying years, she illustrates, are what nightmares are made of. This was her childhood.
One talks about fairy stories and so on. This is testimony, this is fact, this is really what happened.
The reality of her childhood was it was 1945, she was an orphan Jew, and she spent 2 years in a Nazi concentration camp called Theresienstadt. Do you remember much about your time in the camp?
There were no actual memories of the camp until we left because nobody had told a 3-year-old what was going on, that we'd been liberated, hooray, wonderful. Instead of German soldiers, they were Russian soldiers. One lot of uniform, another lot of uniform, who the goodies, who the baddies. They were scary, and especially some of them were from a Cossack division of Russians, so you can imagine they weren't cuddly. And they weren't really interested in us either.
As one of a handful of children to survive Theresienstadt, Joanna was taken to an orphanage just outside of London. She was cared for until a family was found to adopt her. Back then, she went by her birth name, Bela Rosenthal. But when she was finally adopted by an older Jewish couple, she was told to change her name, not speak of her Jewish faith or even her German birthplace, because of the anti-Semitic feelings that still remained in Europe. When did it all sink in of what really happened and who you really were?
I always knew that I was adopted and that my family had perished in the Holocaust, but it was so distant, and my adoptive family wouldn't talk about it, didn't want to do any research, wasn't interested. So they just said, forget about it, move on, you're our daughter now. So really until much later on, as I say, really, well, possibly in the 1980s, an American academic who was interested in child therapy and so on was so persistent that I should do the research, said that I would always regret it if I didn't, and that she really spurred me on, that I had to do it, otherwise it might be too late. So I suppose I did it a bit reluctantly, but now that I've actually found out so much, in a way it's like finding yourself, your real self that was hidden all these years. And I suppose it really brought it home that somehow, I could say, well, this is me, this is who I am. I'm definitely Bela Rosenthal.
Bela spent years researching her family history, discovering old photos. She even met some of her long-lost relatives. At 72 years old, she now feels it is her duty to share her story with others so that we may learn from her past. How do you feel when you share your story with others?
My first feeling is I feel sick, that the world hasn't learnt. And then the second of all, I said, what are people doing about it? Not only what are people doing it, what am I doing about it? Isn't it always the response of people, somebody ought to do something, this is terrible, somebody ought to do it. But you've got to own it yourself. It's me, I've got to do something about it.
So is your message to people that we can choose to make a difference?
We all have a responsibility to try and stop these events. And it is possible to stop them. We all have the power to change, not only our own personal lives, but the political scene. I hope that it would encourage people to take part in voting, for instance, and also being aware of the messages behind some of the political parties. They all sound very attractive on the surface. Remember, Hitler was elected But you've got to look at the small print, what's really going on behind, because genocides can be prevented very easily. But it's because of the inertia that people will say, well, it's somebody else's problem, that the things are allowed to happen, and it's everybody's problem.
The mission of sharing her message has empowered and helped her find her true identity as a survivor.
I am Bela Rosenthal.